Our first story is a local story. Rising Tide went and did some on the street coverage of a rally last weekend. It was a rally organized by the Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression in response to the killing of a man in Oakland last Monday. Last Monday was July 13th. So this man was killed in the early hours of July 13th. And so it was a vigil rally organized by that organization. Other folks like Freedom Road Socialist Organization were out there. Urban Peace Movement 510 were out there, as well as just general community members. So it was really interesting just to be out in community with folks, raising awareness around this issue. And so the big issue with this killing is that, Oakland police have released almost no information. Not even the man's name. We don't even know who this man is that was killed, right? We don't know the exact circumstances. We don't have any body cam footage. There's no flock camera footage because, he was killed in front of 2 different flock cameras, right? And so, I was having a good conversation with one of the youth activists today. I believe they were from the Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and the Urban Peace Movement. And the big thing was just, folks just asking, and this is a big thing with a lot of the liberal anti-police brutality groups. The whole thing is like, we want you to follow the law. You have to follow the law. They can't do any of this stuff. They have to give us the footage. They have to be transparent. But I think that the consistent issue is that whenever they don't want to be transparent, they're not. Right? And then we're just reduced to rallies out on a street corner, getting them to follow basic laws that have been on the books already, right? And it was interesting talking to, some of these activists out there were, 17 years old, right? So it was interesting, as a 33-year-old talking to some of these 17-year-olds just about, them having this basic expectation that police are supposed to follow the law, right? And then having to sort of share my own experience that, I've seen so many of these legislations get put in place, I'm old enough to where I've saw body cameras get introduced. I'm old enough to where I was around when they updated these use of force doctrines, I've seen all these new restraints put on local law enforcement time and time again. I've seen them also flagrantly violated, and so I think, that's just the important thing to make clear within these different rallies, right? It's more than just demanding them to follow the basic law. We actually ultimately have to be really critical of this entire system, that which there's a whole class of people that just get to shoot and kill with impunity if they're determined to be a threat, right? And so I think that was the biggest issue, because again, we don't know anything about this guy, right? It seems like he was a man in a homeless encampment. He was chased by law enforcement and then was just gunned down when he turned around, and apparently he may have had a knife or something, right? And so I think this is the reality for a lot of communities out here where, there's no real communication with law enforcement. There's all of this talk of them, following the basic law, that they won't do. But I think, as we kind of made clear to the youth, the key thing was actually that folks are actually paying attention to this, right? Because I think, in the community of the Bay Area, there is a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of fatigue around trying to fight police brutality. I think, despite what the liberal media would, besides what the conservative media pundits might say, the liberal left, these Democratic cities, we haven't managed to defund one single police department. Right? In the Bay Area, not one police department has seen its budgets cut at any point. I don't think you can, find one local police department in the entire United States that's had their budget cut, if not expanded, since the George Floyd protests of 2020. And so I think, that's a reality, right? That's a reality where we have not been able to make one single concrete step forward using the regular tactics of arguing for liberal reforms, having rallies that are sometimes peaceful, sometimes devolve into spontaneous uprisings of people. That really is not moving the needle on this stuff. OPD, for instance, has killed 3 people this year, unarmed people this year. We're in July. It's reasonable to assume it's going to increase. But again, the key thing was that there was people out actually fighting this stuff, trying to raise awareness of this issue. And so this is a developing story. And so we hope we'll have some more details to report on. Dale, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really good you were able to go out there and talk to different folks that were protesting this. I do think you're right. There is just like a lot of fatigue around people protesting police brutality. Just because it's like it's just exhausting. Even having been a part of this stuff in some capacity or at least aware of it for like a decade, like people asking for these really basic things. I think it was like 10 years ago the Obama administration basically came up with this like blue ribbon report, and a lot of what activists were asking for is like all police departments need to follow by this. SFPD definitely didn't do that. OPD definitely didn't do that. Probably pretty much every police department across the nation didn't actually follow through with all those reforms. And all the while we're seeing, the increase in like militarization from the police, and there's, they always try and throw up smoke as to why it's like, oh, we, can't release this evidence, this investigation is still pending, that sort of stuff. But when it's in their actual interest to release the body cam footage right away, they can do that. They've shown that they can they can upload that stuff the very same day, release it to everybody unedited. But the whole reason why they don't is because they understand that it'll compromise. It might not compromise their position, but it'll compromise the optics around it. And I think that's really what the majority of law enforcement agencies are looking to do, is control the narrative and control the optics around this, by making as much of this information as, inaccessible as possible, even though realistically, like, we as people who live in this country, whether you're a citizen or not, we have the right to this information, and it's pretty sad, honestly, because we've seen, like, as they've introduced these newer forms of technology, it doesn't lead to increased accountability. It doesn't lead to a decrease in there being these types of incidents where people are hurt or people are killed by the police. This ends up happening more because they end up feeling more emboldened, despite the fact that, these technology companies are pretty sketchy. Axon, who is the company that makes the body cameras, they were the ones that made tasers, and they've gotten caught red-handed many times over the years for lying about their products, and the capabilities and, like, what they actually do, that the fact that they're making weapons that kill people or could seriously injure them long term, instead of, how they frame it as like, oh, this is a safer alternative. It's like, wouldn't you rather get shocked than shot? And it's like, well, it's not really an option. You're basically giving them more tools to use. And, just as one last example, like the stuff with the flock stuff is super frustrating, because it's like there's been tons of activists that have shown that Flock is just a really careless company. Their security is really poor. When they hand this infrastructure off, these devices off to these law enforcement agencies, they do a really poor job of implementing that. And what does that open the door to? It allows people to just like go on the internet and like start surveilling other people, as if it wasn't scary enough that the government suddenly has a capacity to start spying on people. Now you're just giving random people the ability to spy on people in the most, ridiculous situations. It's like, why is there like a flock camera pointed at a playground? That sort of thing. It's like that shouldn't even be there to begin with, even if people are like going along with this idea of like, oh, well, they're going to kidnap the kids and that sort of stuff. It's like, well, have you seen who's in charge of this country? Do you really think they give a shit about kids here or anywhere else? So all this stuff isn't surprising, but I think it's really good you made your way out there this past weekend to talk to folks. It'll be interesting to see how this develops over time, if it'll end up, building up some more momentum over time. And I think, yeah, just in general, it's good that we're trying our best to keep our finger on the pulse with this stuff because it's really important to get these get this message out there because there's not really a whole lot of people talking about this incident or a lot of other things that are happening that deserve to be highlighted. So yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think it's yeah, it's like why we have to keep our finger on these issues, and more importantly, why we have to fight the fatigue. But more
Mm-hmm.
importantly, you have to kind of critique the strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that we have to be very clear. What is it we're doing? I was having a conversation with an older comrade recently, and he was making the key point that most activists lack an analysis, right? We don't have an analysis of what's going on in this world, right? We're just responding to things that we don't like more often than not, and I think that's important, right? We have to, if you see something, do something about it, right? Don't just complain, don't just be upset, take some action. But more importantly, with that analysis of actually understanding why these things are going on and how we can address these issues, we're not going to get anywhere,